Okay, so hello everyone. I'm so happy that you are joining us today. It's been a very challenging last several months and especially the last several days. And with that being said, I just want to take a minute to personally thank all of you on behalf of the organizations that you work for doing what you do. Nonprofits play a vital role in building healthy communities by providing critical services that contribute to the economic stability and mobility. We, not only as a nation, but as a world, have seen you step up and fill in some of those gaps that we've been seeing during the pandemic. You've provided PPEs, food, shelter, medical supplies, education and awareness, as well as pastoral support. And the response has just been incredible and overwhelming. So thank you and keep doing what you're doing. There's been a lot of dialogue around planned giving during COVID-19. And the question is, do we or don't we? Our answer, along with many industry experts, is a resounding yes. COVID-19, unfortunately, has forced all ages to confront the reality of death. Our two industry experts that we'll have speaking today, the first one up is Vijay Malavia. Some of you know Vijay personally from your work with him at VeraData. Vijay heads up our digital marketing team and has over 15 years of experience in performance marketing and biddable media. He's led integrated campaigns for a wide range of Fortune 500 clients. Our next speaker will be Patrick Schmitt. Patrick previously served as the head of email fundraising for President Obama and the head of innovation at change.org. Patrick is currently the co-CEO and co-founder of freewill.com, which has raised over $1.4 billion in planned gifts over the last 3 years. We're going to save some time at the end of discussion to answer some of your questions. So you'll see there in the box Q&A. So please type your questions in there. And Vijay, I'll let you take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you for such a great introduction, Dina, and couldn't echo your sentiments more. Very grateful for all of you to be here, and grateful for Patrick for putting this webinar together. Really, I'm excited to talk to all of you about what we're seeing playing out in the digital landscape as a result of COVID-19. I'm excited to walk through some trends and really start to look at the nuances of some of these behaviors that we see, and then how these behaviors are sort of evolving over time as we learn more and as we progress, and as we start to see changes being instated across the United States. Ultimately, we want to really take a look at how we can take learnings from these data points, these data signals, and these trends, and apply them in a meaningful and relevant way to improve our fundraising programs and our planned giving programs for nonprofit organizations. And to really assess the situation right now, we need to look at a couple of different things. We need to look back and we need to look at these current trends. But what we know in terms of what's happening right now is when people feel their lives are at risk and when they're facing unknowns, they pivot to prevention and planning. And we've seen evidence of that in the digital space. Nielsen actually uncovered preventative, sort of proactive versus reactive planning as two distinct behaviors that have emerged as a result of COVID-19. And ultimately, throughout this prioritization of prevention and planning is also, there's still this high value that people place in helping others. And when we look at just the reaction over the past several weeks, we know that Giving Tuesday Now, for example, was announced just 6 weeks before the date and generated almost as much online revenue as Giving Tuesday Now 2019. We know that when these studies are validated, when people are reminded of their mortality, they're not only more generous, but also more satisfied the more money they donated. And I think what's really interesting is when we start to look at specifically what people did immediately. They flocked online for this information around prevention and planning, and they went to search engines and they started to search. And what was really interesting was looking at how that search behavior evolved over time. And Google provides several resources to help us better understand how people are searching for COVID-19. This is one of those resources, and they lay out a timeline at the very top that's charting the very beginning of January on the very left, and we're going all the way into mid to late May on the far right. And it's just giving us a visual depiction of how the types of things that people were searching for started to change and evolve. It started, as we would assume, with general knowledge and general queries, but quickly started to pivot over to, again, that prevention and planning, those symptoms and treatments and preparedness. But once we started to think about our health, we started to think about other, like our physical health, we started to think about our financial health. We started to search for things like economic impact, which we coupled with searches around the government response. And just a few days or weeks into being at home, we were quickly trying to think of ways to connect and gather remotely, and you start to see those types of queries trend. But what's really interesting is within each of these categories, we start to see two distinct sort of types of searches emerging. And that is searches that are more along the lines of what is versus searches that are containing how to. And those two small words actually give us a lot of insight into the intent and where someone is in a respective stage of a journey. Those what is searches are certainly more informational, whereas those how-to searches are indicative of either preparing for some task or aiming to complete some task. And we saw a variety of what is and how-to searches emerging, like what is a furlough, how to get a stimulus check. And we would see this behavior throughout all of those categories. And I think the takeaway here is that this is a natural and normal behavior that we see in search, and it's important that when people are asking these questions that we are providing relevant answers in the form of digital content that can be indexed by a search engine so that your organizations can appear for informational searches related to plan giving when people are still very much in an infancy stage of learning, but also be present and be relevant and be able to create utility when people are shifting those searches into more of those task-oriented types of queries. And search was just one of the ways that we started to, areas that we started to see this uptick in. Ultimately, we saw all age groups flocking online for information. We saw huge upticks and surges in news consumption from publications large and small. We saw video consumption skyrocket. We saw people more active, not only in search, but also in social media and having conversations that maybe they didn't have at the same frequency, at the same depth, or at all. For example, younger people starting to have more open conversations around mortality and planning. But we also saw like a huge shift in just the way that people had to live as a result of the at-home shelter orders. E-commerce, for example, we saw what we projected to occur within 10 to 15 years occur within several weeks in terms of seeing older age groups and older age brackets really starting to participate in e-commerce, buying products online, subscribing to digital services. We saw this this acceleration across all age groups, but specifically we also saw the older age demographic, which prior had a preference for going into a store, starting to become more comfortable with transacting online and completing more complex tasks online. And that's important because it does expose an opportunity, when we look at this increase in amount of people going online, when we look at these conversations that are taking place, we look at just like search activity for things like how to make a will online or online estate planning. All of those things are trending up as a result of COVID-19. So it uncovers this opportunity to be visible and present, to get in front of your audience, because now is the opportune time to get in front of your audience. And it's important that when we meet them wherever they are in their journey, meeting them on their turf, and ultimately, and this is something that everyone is clamoring for right now, is just being human and being authentic in doing so, and being personal. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about each of these, because it's really important when we think about what it means to be visible and relevant. We know where people spend their time. Specifically, when we look at it by demographic, where we're able to identify the properties and the places where people are spending the most time online. And ultimately, we are urging our clients, and we are seeing advantages to being a first mover and to being able to establish a presence across these different online apps, properties, and platforms. Because right now, media inventory is still valued below traditional norms. There's a number of categories and large brands that have either canceled planned campaigns, pulled back on campaigns, or they're just not advertising at all. So right now is a really opportune time, knowing that people are coming online at an increasing rate, to put your message, your organization's message, in front of them and take advantage of what could be some discounted rates as it relates to cost per 1,000 impressions or cost per click. A very good time to potentially increase share of voice by again meeting those prospects and those donors on their turf. And then really, when you meet them, we want to think about ways that we can empower choice. So we just talked through how digital seems to be something that people are increasingly turning to. But when we think about the tasks that we're aiming to complete along this journey, for example, collecting information, email addresses, or even more valuable, phone numbers, we want to minimize the number of hoops that we're asking people to jump through, because when we do that, it helps maximize the response rates. Ultimately, we want to empower choice. If people feel more comfortable calling to provide information, or going to your website and filling out a form, or, for example, staying on the very sticky social property that they're on, that they've been trained that they can complete tasks within that property and continue to consume information within that property. For example, Facebook has done an excellent job of that with their different ads aimed at either lead generation or donations in commerce. But ultimately, utilizing data to inform when you put these messages in front of the audience, and then leveraging ad units that will help remove friction can increase response rates along the way. And when you're thinking about how to bring all of this to life, there is certainly a prioritization as it relates to level of effort versus level of impact. And it doesn't make sense to attempt to do it all at once. But when you think about breaking it up into stages, in a first sort of phase, you would want to focus on demand collection. And here, it makes sense to target hand raisers. Google offers both a grant for non-profit organizations, as well as their traditional Google paid search and Google Ads offerings, where you can, again, put your ads in front of people who are actively looking for your organization or searching for keywords that are closely related to your cause and to your mission. Facebook and Instagram is a place where we know that audiences above age 45 and 55 spend a disproportionate amount of time as it relates to social. And display remarketing is simply a great tactic for getting a message back in front of someone who was on the website, who potentially was close to completing a task but didn't exactly complete it. From there, we want to think about scaling the program. And I'd like to call out YouTube, because one of the trends that we've seen as a result of COVID-19 is an increase in connected TV viewing. YouTube just released a product for advertisers that will enable us to start to put those ads in front of connected TV audiences in an effort to drive awareness and ultimately create impressions and exposure against an audience that we can scale, but in a targeted way, taking advantage of all of the Google targeting features. And then finally, in the run phase, I would encourage everyone to think through Facebook Messenger, because it uncovers a unique opportunity to have one-to-one conversations with high-value donors, and in an environment where they may feel more comfortable answering some of your questions, really providing some of their preferences, providing information, or ultimately even for fundraising purposes. It could be an excellent tool for nurturing, and it just provides another vehicle to have that one-to-one conversation. And when we think about what this looks like when we bring it to life, we're looking at, on the left-hand side, our audiences, which range from CRM audiences and then also non-CRM audiences, but ultimately looking at their behavior to personalize a triggered message and a triggered communication. We bring that to life for our clients via search, by retargeting people who are searching for generic terms. We look at tactics where we can employ on-site personalization for the headlines or for the images that people see based on the pages that they have visited and the content that they have consumed. We look across all of these different addressable channels, whether it's display or video, for behavioral signals that give us the opportunity to take the conversation one step further and to provide the donors and the prospective donors with valuable content and ultimately experiences that they can start to see themselves in the mission or in the organization itself. And that's really how we start to bring it to life through this personalized and nuanced approach.
Amazing. Thank you, Vijay. Really excited to sort of share a little bit more. But before I do, I just wanted to sort of highlight the amazing work that I think Vijay and Dina do. I think in a lot of cases, a lot of technology, the nonprofit world lags, 3, 4, 5 years behind the commercial world or the for-profit world in terms of cutting edge tactics and use of data, et cetera. And I just love that they take a lot of the best practices in the world and bring them to the most important causes on the planet. And so, some of these tools have been really well designed to sell beautiful white sneakers. And if we can turn them into also, delivering on anti-poverty missions and public media and so much more. And so just a huge thank you to them. And it's been sort of delightful to learn from them throughout our friendship. So really appreciate that. So my name is Patrick. I'm sort of 2/3 of the way back in this photo because I'm 6'4" when I'm not on webcam. And I'm really lucky to be part of a company we call FreeWill. FreeWill works with about 360 nonprofit partners. Normally we are tight-knit, very close community in New York City. Right now we are all working from home across the country. I'm really lucky to work with so many great organizations and actually have driven almost $1.5 billion in bequests, mostly through relentless curiosity and experimentation. So excited to share some of what we've learned in the last few years together with you today, in hopes that it also furthers your mission as well. So when Vijay was talking about this shift from what if or what is to how to, it's been a lot of how we think about things generally. And moving people who are sort of taken as a given that human nature is generous and supportive and interested in impact, but often can't really navigate the how to have impact. And if we can just smooth out that process a little bit, you can move mountains. And I saw this a lot with my experience in change.org and others as well. And so one of the things we implemented that I really love at FreeWill is something called Science Club. And the only goal of Science Club is that every year we have to run 40 different experiments to understand more about how people are giving, what's holding them back, what's driving behavior, what makes people give more, what makes people more willing to give, what makes people more willing to return a second time to give, et cetera, et cetera. And so really excited to share some of these experiments with you. And some of you, I think on the call, I've seen some familiar faces, have run these experiments alongside us. And it's really exciting to be learning together, not just so we can advance your mission, but so we can advance the whole nonprofit sector. We've really focused on planned giving. That's what a lot of folks are here for. And we realized that humans are just generally rough at estate planning. And that was the first major barrier. Jenny, my co-founder, and I met at Stanford. We did a ton of research around this as grad students and realized that about 71% of Americans have no up-to-date will. That's American adults. It's pretty stark. But the second piece here is actually that from a behavioral standpoint, giving is very rarely prompted within these conversations. So if someone goes to an attorney or they go to LegalZoom, which is becoming increasingly popular, nobody asks about charitable giving. And when that happens, giving drops by about 85% just because of these slight behavioral nudges. Now, part of that is that estate planning is a foreign concept to many people. And so they don't have behavior in their own past to follow. They also don't see their friends do it. And so, if we were all in a meeting together right now, about 60, 70% of the men in the room, including me, would probably be wearing like a blue button-down t-shirt, because that's what we saw, or blue button-down Oxford, excuse me. I'm too casual in work from home. And that's because we're witnessing other people and trying to mirror their behavior. Now, in estate planning, you don't get to see people do it. And so it's very actually much more malleable behavior than you would think otherwise. And so as we thought about what's called free will, we designed a whole approach, which was specifically making estate planning easier and then putting planned giving front and center. And this sort of giving folks an avenue of how to on top of the what if or what is, which is the more common approach historically. And so from the behavioral science element, you can not just make planning or gift planning more common, you can make gift planning to your organization 20 times more likely. Because historically, no one has asked about charitable giving within estate planning, but they certainly haven't asked about planned giving to something like Human Rights Watch, which I know is on the phone, and we love them so much. So it's a huge shift overall. And so as we've done this, we've created customized versions. And one thing that's really interesting, and you can do this in your own planned giving work, is we tested probably 12 different variations of actually how to ask about gifts. And so instead of saying, would you like to leave a gift? We just decided to say, okay, which organizations would you like to give? And that subtle shift in language created about 30% more planned gifts from exactly the same people. Now, you can't see this in the screenshot, but farther down the page is a button that says, no, thanks, I don't want to do it. So you're not forced into it. But having that norm changing a little bit so that it shows that many people are doing something similar has a pretty dramatic effect. And when you think about 30% more requests, that's roughly equal to about $400 million increased planned gifts since that experiment happened. So really small shift, no real technology involved, just a little language change is really powerful here. The other thing that's pretty important is actually what kind of gifts you ask for. So one experiment we ran and realized is that asking for gifts in percentages of estates increases the amount by up to 5 times over just asking for a planned gift generally. And it's because a lot of people will say, great, I'll leave you $1,000, because they underestimate the size of their own estate. And they often think, okay, well, what if bad things happen? And so percentage gifts end up being a larger portion in many cases because it will ebb and flow based on the size of the estate, et cetera. Other things like including messages with a gift. This is why I'm so passionate about this college, or this is why I'm so passionate about this nature organization, then opens up avenues for more real-time giving. Because you can say, I've heard that you're really passionate about this land trust for these 3 reasons. Would you like to talk about having more of an impact on that organization? And so these sort of small tweaks actually result in pretty large expansions of giving. We're grateful to sort of have this collaborative approach with nonprofits that help with all these experiments. And then the other thing, and some of you are newer to planned giving and some of you are neck deep in it. And those that are neck deep realize that one of the biggest challenges in planned giving historically has been that fewer than 20% of donors even tell the organization that they're making a planned gift. And so we set out to change that. And we had 8 unsuccessful experiments trying to get more and more people to say, yes, send my information to charities. But the 9th experiment from 2 of my colleagues moved our, what we call the opt-in rate, which is people that say, yes, send me this information, from about 42% to over 70%. So pretty amazing. And all of those people are donors that we can follow up with immediately, but also continue to steward so the gifts stay in the will, and in many cases get even larger. You know, the other thing that we've seen has been real joy across some of the smarter organizations is that they moved to big data maybe 10, 12 years ago, if not earlier, in annual giving. But planned giving has sort of been absent from the big data world. So it's hard to see macro trends on what locations, what genders, what ages, what type of donor behavior is indicates that someone is most likely to leave a planned gift. And so as we can start tracking these, not just gifts, but site traffic, et cetera, you actually see a much more coherent plan start to take shape because you can base it on data and not merely the intuition of a board member, which has sort of happened in the past to a pretty significant degree. And I'm sure that some of you are nodding from personal experience. And then, you know, I think the path forward, as you look at the next 3, 5, 6, 7 years in planned giving, is that people are not just sort of taking on some new approaches and locking them in. It's this move to endless iteration made possible by better data in the first place. So if you don't have data, you can't run experiments, and so you just send the same mailer every year. But what we've seen is being able to track in real-time giving shows, you know, in this one case, a 3 times increase when we started changing the messaging around planned gifts. Same amount of mail, same amount of email, et cetera, 3 times more money just from some subtle changes, not because we were smart and we knew it was going to work, but because we were able to be curious and see what was available. And so we've seen a lot of nonprofits increase their experimentation, not just on annual giving, which has happened for quite a long time, but now moving into major and planned giving in a big way. And that's one of the most exciting trends. And then, you know, one thing, and this is sort of from our own work as a company, they should say less than 1 hour of setup. You know, we were able to really continue to listen to our partners and say, what is the thing that's holding you back? And what we heard is that a lot of planned giving teams don't necessarily have access to the IT teams or the web folks or whatever it may be. And that was the key unlocker. And similarly, the sort of smartest organizations right now are really listening to donors as much as possible, especially in a moment like this, to understand what is it they need right now and what is the one thing holding them back so that they can actually proactively change that. And as more data and use more listening skills, that is one of the things that will be the biggest leap forward. In many cases, that unlock allows for much more potential money coming through. All right, so that is a wrap for what Vijay and I were going to present. We'll invite Vijay back onto video and off mute, but we wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. We know that data and experimentation is hard and complicated, and we'd love to be answering anything particular to your organization or overall on meta trends. So feel free to just drop things in the chat. There's a small enough group that we should be able to easily manage that. And Vijay and I will sort of air traffic control between us to figure out what to answer first. Vijay, while other folks are typing their questions, let me start one with you. When you looked at the overall data trends for, especially around the onset of coronavirus, what was the most surprising to you? I mean, you're an expert here, but obviously this is totally unprecedented. What caught you off guard, or what did you not expect?
There were a couple of things that did catch me a little bit off guard. One of the things that caught me off guard was just how rapid a device shift we started to see across the regions where the at-home shelters were in place. People have grown very comfortable and familiar with their mobile devices in terms of doing a variety of different tasks, ranging from remaining connected to entertainment, ordering groceries and cars and everything in between. but seeing that quick shift that we saw to the larger screens, whether that was the tablet or the desktop, and then certainly with connected TV, was something that caught me a little bit off guard, just in terms of how quickly we saw that occur. But it really makes sense, and when you're presented with an option to have a much larger screen to consume content, it's usually much easier for a number of different reasons. But I think that also brought about a lot more second and third screening behavior. So when people are looking at those larger screens, they're still active on their mobile devices. I think that was one of the interesting things to see just immediately coming out of the first few weeks of the at-home orders.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's really interesting, because a lot of mobile advertising is even cheaper than desktop advertising. And now if you're catching someone who's online at the grocery store or driving to work when they shouldn't be texting, that's not as useful. But when folks are mostly home, it's a really big advantage. So that's really insightful. My colleague Simone did just drop a link in the chat, and we'd really love your feedback on what would be helpful next time, etc. So please fill that out while we get to a few more. Lori asks, what's the most effective way to get your management to understand the importance of using data to secure a planned gift when the ROI is not ASAP, but years away? This is a great question. And on a resources page that maybe we can send out after, we have a whole sort of strategic memo that we've shared with folks on how and why to invest in planned giving. There are probably two big things I would say. One is sort of demonstrate the overall mix of bequests versus corporate, foundation, individual. And what you'll see is that while being long-term, the average bequest on a site like FreeWill is more than $70,000 from the same people who are giving $200 checks otherwise. And so, do we want, we've already engaged these people, would we like to also get $70,000, $80,000, $100,000 from them when we've been asking them for $20 a month for a couple years? And so just making sure that folks really have their heads around the delta between how small an annual gift is compared to what is quite typically 2,000 times larger a bequest. And so that's one. Two is helping folks to understand that planned giving usually leads to increased real-time giving. And there's really interesting data about how a planned gift makes someone give 75% more over the subsequent 5 years as well. So those are two things. There's a lot more I could say, but that's a really big avenue. Ed asks the question of, how did we identify planned giving as a place to start and grow an organization? So as Dina mentioned, my background was in small dollar giving. I worked for President Obama. We invented a lot of the best practices in small dollar fundraising. And then I looked at some of the math that I was just sharing with Lori, that I said, we've worked so hard to make it really easy for you to text to give or to give $12 monthly. Why are we not making it significantly easier to give $100,000 at a time if that's someone's largest gift? And to me, there was just a big unmet need. Definitely, sometimes I'll tell people that, at no point in any of my coloring books as a 6-year-old were there any trusts and estates or any planned giving. It wasn't sort of a big dream, but actually when you began to think about what's the biggest possible impact we could make, this was became actually a relatively obvious and an underserved area. I think Vijay and Dina, who are doing a lot of great work here, know that historically there's been less innovation in planned giving than other areas, despite how meaningful and how powerful it is for many organizations.
Patrick, maybe you want to talk about the ease of the will on the actual website. So I went through the actual exercise. Maybe you want to speak a little bit about the actual practicality of it and what it looks like and how a user would engage.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the principles that we started with, and this comes a lot from annual giving, is something has to be as easy as possible and really has to be as valuable as possible to the user to drive behavior. And so what we realized is that by offering services to folks, they would actually generate way more giving than if we just push the idea of planned giving. So in our work, an estate plan takes about 25 minutes to complete. It's extremely thorough. We have some great legal experts on board making sure it's valid in every state. And then folks, if they need to, can take that documentation to a lawyer if they have a more complicated plan. But what we found is that we've been able to smooth out so many of the speed bumps that about 60-ish% of people who start finish, which is sort of off the charts for anything based on the web. But because the biggest hurdle for many people is getting in front of them and getting started, which is why a lot of the avenues that Vijay discussed was so important, right? No one wakes up on a Wednesday and says, today is estate planning day. But they do know they need it. And so if you can find them in the right place and then give a really sort of low friction process, it can be remarkably effective.
Great.
Great. Vijay, maybe one more question for you, and then we can wrap up as people fill out the survey. You know, when we look for, we've sort of talked a lot about, you know, what's happening, what to expect. What do you think is one of the big trends that hasn't yet happened that you're excited about?
One of the big trends that hasn't yet happened that I'm excited about, well, I think that as people are yearning for more authentic voices and more authentic stories and communications from brands and organizations, it exposes a big opportunity for us to shift some of our mindset as it relates to the way that we think about creative for our planned campaigns. It's not to say that we shouldn't invest, you know, in the best suited creative at a high production value that conveys all of the different characteristics that are really important to the organization and to the brand. But it does open up an opportunity for just much more authentic content that doesn't have that same production element, not only within social channels, but also within owned properties, such as like your website, or if you have a mobile app. Those types of more authentic, you know, behind the scenes sort of views of the organization and of the people, of the actual volunteers, of the donors themselves. I think just being authentic and putting that forward within creative is an opportunity that I'm starting to see, you know, in some executions and in some marketing communications. I expect to see much more of that moving ahead as people are, again, looking for that, you know, that real authentic content.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's actually exactly what I was going to say, is that I think a work from home period where everyone sort of sees into everybody's living rooms, a dog barking or a child, has sort of dispelled the myth that there's this like hyper polished professional you and then real you. And I think it's built actually much stronger connections through the people that we've got to spend time with. All right, well, but we can wrap up there. Thank you everyone for joining. Dina, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you Vijay and Patrick for a great discussion. We're happy to follow up individually. If you can fill out the surveys Patrick mentioned, that would be great. We're going to send a copy of the recording as well as the deck. And it feels a little bit like Magic Garden. So I can't wait to be able to see you all. Patrick doesn't know Magic Garden, so I'm looking forward to being able to see you all in person soon. So thanks for attending, and have a great afternoon, everyone.
Take care all.